I actually think that white and black people making similar music and crossing over that way can't be anything but a good thing.
Before the event, however, George Michael brought out another solo single, A Different Corner. It was a song that he later claimed was his first truly autobiographical work. It reached the top spot in Britain and number 7 in America. There was another project as well, which saw George jetting off to Detroit to record a duet with soul legend Aretha Franklin on a song called I Knew You Were Waiting For Me, co-written by veteran country writer Dennis Morgan and up-and-coming British songwriter Simon Climie. With George close to drowning in the responsibilities and recriminations of his own career, just having to arrive at a studio and open his mouth must have been a great relief. But back in the real world, he had to work on the final Wham EP tracks, The Edge of Heaven, Battle Stations, Where Did Your Heart Go, a cover of a Was Not Was number, plus the remix Wham Rap 86, which included Elton John on piano. Not surprisingly, the EP went to number 1 in the band's final week of life. This hectic period saw 2 warm-up shows at the Brixton Academy, a final Top of the Pops appearance, and that famous final concert at Wembley before a crowd of 72,000, a sellout. There was a final burst of Wham activity when the release of a double album of 12-inch mixes, which went to number 2 in Britain and peaked at 10 in the USA album charts. The stage had been set and decks cleared for George's solo career, but suddenly he seemed at a loss, as a holiday to recharge his batteries just got longer and longer with aimless days and drunken nights. Only the company of new friend Kathy Young seemed to bolster his confidence, but she had her own work commitments to take care of. He was putting on weight with the drink and experimenting with other drugs, especially ecstasy, but also marijuana and cannabis. Amazingly, it was a visit from Ridgely and a drinking session heart to heart that helped put George into a better frame of mind. When Andrew returned to Europe, George was ready to get back to work on the songs for his first solo album. His confidence enjoyed a real boost when his duet with Aretha Franklin leaped to number 1 on both sides of the Atlantic, giving the veteran soul star her first USA number 1 since 1967's Respect. In Britain, it was her first number 1 ever. He had new management with Americans Rob Kahane and his partner lawyer Michael Lippman. The old Wham magic delighted an AIDS benefit concert at Wembley Arena, when Ridgely joined George on stage for one song, but he quickly slipped out of the limelight again, leaving George on stage to complete his set. George's first post-Wham release was the controversial I Want Your Sex in June '87. The video was banned in Britain and edited 3 times by MTV before they would show it in America. He had to go on the record to deny the song promoted promiscuous sex and accepted a reduced royalty rate on the video in order to sell it more cheaply to fans.
It was naive of me. When I look back and I look at the videos, obviously the image was going to work. So I was really convinced that I was on a different path, and then it became massive with Faith, and I realised that I was even more miserable than when I'd split up Wham, and the reason I split up Wham was because I was miserable.
Despite the fuss from I Want Your Sex, the single reached number 3 in Britain and 1 place higher in the USA, and George was soon back at work on his first solo album, now to be called Faith. He decided to change his image. He said goodbye to what remained of his frothy poppy look, turned his hair black again after a blonde spell, and dressed in black with a matching leather jacket and a crucifix earring. The single Faith reached number 2 in Britain, but was a Christmas number 1 in America. The album went straight to the top spot in Britain and had 2 spells as a number 1 in America, spending a good year in the top 10 and staying in the top 100 there until May 1989. But matters outside his control were taking place that would have a profound impact on his career. CBS, with their Columbia and Epic labels, were bought by electronics giant Sony. Thus they acquired George Michael along with an impressive roster of artists including Michael Jackson, Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan and Barbra Streisand. Many of the CBS artists were very alarmed at a Japanese electronics firm without music business experience taking over their careers. All seemed well at first, however, with confirmation that CBS's Records Group president, Walter Yetnikoff, and his senior executives would be staying on. Indeed, George was made an offer to provide 7 albums over 15 years with a cash advance of $11 million. He had decided now that he needed a big tour to consolidate the success of the Faith album as quickly as possible. It would also put him firmly on a level with contemporaries like Prince, Madonna and Michael Jackson. But the tour was really grueling. 10 months on the road, taking in Japan, Australia, Europe and the United States, where 46 concerts closed it out. There were 160 dates in total, and ticket sales would total 20 million. The Rolling Stones would have tackled it with their perfect blend of Jack Daniels and health foods. But George wasn't happy on the road, and his earlier experiences of touring had been pretty bad. Just before the travelling circus started, he found he had shares in an American firm that was supplying the Contra rebels in Nicaragua with arms in their bid to eject the elected Sandinista communist government. His financial advisors were told to get rid of the offending stock immediately and make sure that nothing like that happened again. His political credentials intact, the tour could begin, and he set off with a chef and a personal trainer to help him eat well and keep healthy. In the aftermath of John Lennon's violent death, he also had a posse of bodyguards to keep him healthy in another way. Touring was just as bad an experience as he feared it would be. He felt lonely, yet at the same time unable to socialise with his band or road crew. He was also troubled by throat pains and feared for his voice. Doctor after doctor had failed to detect anything physically wrong, though his mood was lightened when One More Try, another single taken from the Faith album, gave him another American #1. It reached number 8 in Britain. But his throat problem wouldn't go away, and some concerts had to be cancelled. The constant visit to doctors provoked press speculation that he was being tested for AIDS, but eventually a trip to a leading London specialist yielded the unwelcome information that he had a large cyst at the base of his throat. Once a run of 5 concerts at Earl's Court, plus a 70th birthday concert for Nelson Mandela at Wembley were out the way, George had the cyst removed in hospital. Another track from Faith, Monkey, was specially remixed for the Black American market by Jimmy Tam and Terry Lewis, a pair of Prince's former band members. The effort paid off and became George's 3rd American #1 of the year, but it only reached number 13 in Britain. A month after the operation, he was back on the road in the USA for 40 sell-out concerts in a row, with Madonna, Janet Jackson and Whitney Houston turning up to see him on successive nights at the Forum in Los Angeles. The tour eventually ended in Pensacola, Florida on October the 31st, 1988. It had tested George to the limit. He had been ill and he'd been moody and temperamental at times, but somehow he had come through it.
My sense of purpose still is really a creative one, and I'd like to think that I'll drop dead being creative. You know, I'd love to think that on the day I die, I'll still be working towards something in a creative sense.
The tour closed with another single from the Faith album. Kissing a Fool reached number 5 in America, but again did less well in Britain, peaking at a disappointing 18. Perhaps the fact that so many people had been buying the album had been reducing the sales of singles taken from it. Faith remains one of the all-time bestsellers, with sales to date over 15 million worldwide. And at the peak of all this success, at the height of his fame, George Michael went home to North London. It would be 2 years before another single was released. The success of the Faith album and tour gave George the clout to renegotiate his CBS contract, and after a suitable break, he began to think about his next album, the first of 7 he had agreed to in his new contract. He collected another Ivor Novello Award in London for Songwriter of the Year, 1988, and 3 top honours at the American Music Awards in Los Angeles. Favourite Male Artist, Rock and Pop, Favourite Album, Soul and R&B, and Favourite Male Artist, Soul, R&B. He bought himself a very spacious second home overlooking the Pacific in Santa Barbara, California, a much grander affair than his house in Hampstead, though he would still consider London his #1 home. Throughout 1989 and much of 1990, he shuttled between the 2 properties, working on tracks for his next album, to be called Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1. His recording schedule was so tight that he had to pull out of a charity concert at Nebworth, which included Paul McCartney, Elton John, Eric Clapton and Phil Collins. His withdrawal gave him some bad publicity, but when the top brass at CBS heard the material for the new album, they were knocked out and wanted to renegotiate the deal with him once again. However, CBS were changing as the Sony buy-up began to take effect. There were massive personal changes, and when Walter Yetnikoff resigned along with a host of other long-standing CBS executives, the old company was gone forever. Most of the people George trusted at CBS had left, and he ran into problems with their replacements when he declined to involve himself in the publicity merry-go-round for the new album. He wanted the music to speak for and to sell itself, and he felt his days as a teenage idol were, or should be, behind him. He turned down all interviews save one for British TV arts programme The South Bank Show, and refused to make any videos to support single releases, as he felt the imagery in them was all too often at odds with what he was trying to say with his music, which he felt was getting deeper and more subtle all the time. His inaction certainly got him noticed. Frank Sinatra, no less, fired off a fiery letter to the Los Angeles Times, attacking George for not playing the showbiz game that was expected of him. George, of course, felt his songwriting to be more important to him than performing, and must have been alarmed at the prospect of adopting the high kind of profile of a supernova like Sinatra. He was further troubled by the breakup of his American management team, Kahane and Lipman, and when CBS decided to release Praying for Time from the new album as a single, after hearing the finished tapes in July 1990, he refused to appear in a promotional video. It reached number 6 in Britain, but gave him his 9th number 1 in the United States. And so the album came out. Artists always find it very difficult to follow spectacularly successful albums, so even if George had played the promotion game to the letter, it is doubtful if Listen Without Prejudice Volume 1 would have topped Faith. Even so, it went straight to number 1 in Britain and remained in the album charts for 55 weeks. In the States, it peaked at number 2, but stayed in the Billboard Top 100 for 34 weeks.
I made a real effort in my life over the last 10 years to try and make my life a rounded thing without having to interact with the public, so that I could keep making music, so that they would still want something that I was doing.
By anyone else's standards, the album was a success, but the sentiments were not shared by CBS, who felt that what they considered to be George's Greta Garbo act had sabotaged the project. He surfaced later in 1990 with the Tony Parsons ghost-written autobiography, Bear. He reaffirmed his hostility to the public relations aspect of the music business and said that he would appear in no more videos, give no more interviews and tour very little. In America, the track Freedom 90 from the album was released, while in Britain, Waiting for the Day was chosen. Neither set the charts on fire, and CBS was also unhappy about George's association with AIDS charities. When US troops in the Gulf War adopted Praying for Time as their unofficial anthem, George expressed his unhappiness at being associated with the forces, and CBS weren't happy with that either. With sales of 7 million, the album went multi-platinum, but CBS considered it a failure and a lost opportunity to build on the massive success of Faith. When Waiting for the Day was released in America, it only reached 27, and George further angered his record company bosses by stating that on the short 12-day international tour he was planning, he would only perform material by other artists, and would ignore the songs of his new album. As it was, he performed Freedom 90 on what was now called the Cover to Cover tour. He enjoyed some light relief during the month-long Rock in Rio 11 festival, sharing the stage once more with Andrew Ridgeley, who joined him on stage during Careless Whisper. By this time he had come to accept his homosexuality, but it still wasn't common knowledge. One step along the way was his friendship with gay Brazilian Anselmo Falepa. He was a couple of years older than George and helped the troubled singer find himself in a way that no one else could have at the time. CBS wanted to find him touring in the markets that mattered. More singles were released from the Prejudiced album, Mother's Pride in America, and Heal the Pain in Britain. Neither did any real business, and when Cowboys and Angels disappeared from the British chart after a month, George stopped any more singles being pulled from the album. Despite the friction between record company and star, His contract was renegotiated once more in a $60 million deal. He gained his own label, Hard Rock Records, financed with $100,000 by Epic. George would put in $250,000. The idea was that he would use the new label to record covers while his own songs would stay on Epic. Wanting to spend more time with Philippa, he still refused to give the Prejudiced album a last tour, and after a holiday in the Rio sun, he came back to London to work on Listen Without Prejudice Volume 2, which he planned to release in late summer. The dispute with CBS Sony then flared up again, with high-voltage faxes and telephone calls flying back and forth, and George stopped work on the new album and devoted his time to raising money for various AIDS projects, including the production of 3 tracks for a charity album. With the pop world still in a state of shock over the AIDS-related death of Queen's frontman Freddie Mercury, his duet with Elton John on Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, recorded in concert earlier in the year, was released as an AIDS charity single. It topped the charts on both sides of the Atlantic, but CBS were unhappy. The tough guy image that had proved so successful with Faith seemed too much at odds with George's current persona and his increasing support for homosexual causes. George was beyond caring what Epic, CBS or Sony thought. It was his career and he would run it as he saw fit. He appeared at an AIDS awareness tribute concert to Freddie Mercury at Wembley, and despite a very real fall in his income with no new product to put out, he was a generous giver to charity. Indeed, in 1992 he was named as Britain's most generous star in a survey by the Directory of Social Change, which claimed he had donated some $500,000 in the previous 12 months. Up to now, his dispute with Sony had been kept under wraps, but with no new material coming out and his record company seemingly in the dark about his future plans, it was becoming clear to his fans that something was wrong. George was unhappy with the promotion of his charity single Too Funky, which reached number 4 in the UK, but only number 10 in the USA. Sony weren't very keen on his projected Trojan Souls album. He was writing the material and producing it, but was leaving the singing to Elton John, Anita Baker and Aretha Franklin. There was an attempt to end the deadlock with Sony when George attended a couple of meetings with the top brass, including one with the company's world president, Noria Oga. He felt that he explained his problems well and expected to be released from his contract. It was not to be, and he filed a writ at the High Court in London claiming his Sony contract was restraint of trade. His detailed account of his dealings with the company were intended to show just how much artists, even huge stars like himself, were under the thumb of the music industry. It was a complex case that would keep the corporate lawyers happy for months, and in the meantime George prepared an EP of tracks recorded at the previous year's Freddie Mercury benefit. This featured him performing with the remaining members of Queen and duetting with Lisa Stanfield on one song. Then a tragedy of his own struck with a sudden death from a brain hemorrhage of his close Brazilian friend Anselmo Philippa. He grieved deeply, and in the aftermath of the death, public speculation on George's sexuality increased. The first track on the Mercury tribute EP, Somebody to Love, gave George his 9th number 1 in Britain, just in time for his 30th birthday. In America, the EP was counted as an album and had to be split into 2 singles for release, but neither reached the top 20. In the meantime, the legal arguments moved back and forth in London. Sony made an out-of-court settlement offer to try and keep a piece of their star, which George rejected. If George and his manager Kahane thought the offer meant Sony were on the run, they were wrong. Claim and counterclaim were made in court, but the whole affair ended on April the 13th, 1994. Mrs. Justice Parker found in Sony's favour, citing the renegotiation of the contract, the advances made to the singer by the record company and George's access to and use of legal advice to shape and contest the contract. The judge also had some harsh words to say about Kahane's role in the affair, but at a press conference after the verdict, George repeated his desire to break with Sony. He said he would refuse to record for them, even if it meant kicking his heels until his contract expired in 2003. He also intended to appeal against the ruling. The whole business was still spiralling out of control, with both parties having spent between £3 and £4 million apiece, and costs were still to be awarded. One thing George did agree with the judge on was Kahane, who only lasted as his manager for another 4 months.
I think people generally thought that I thought that if I actually declared that I was gay, I would suffer some huge loss of audience, and I never believed that. I might have believed that back in the days of Wham. Me and the press was like two dogs with a bone.
Given all that had been going on, writing new songs had proved very difficult. But he produced one, the haunting Jesus to a Child, which he performed for the first time at the MTV European Awards in Berlin. His own problems didn't blind him to the misfortunes of others either, and he and Eric Clapton pooled resources to secure compensation for the family of Nigel Brown, a bodyguard both had employed and who had died in a helicopter accident. He allowed Capital Radio to broadcast Jesus to a Child for their regular Help a London Child fundraising event, chipping in with 30,000 of his own to boost the final figure to 70,000 raised by the song, which of course couldn't be released until the Sony deadlock was broken. Negotiations went on through 1995 until American music and film mogul David Geffen effected a breakthrough. He had teamed up with film director Steven Spielberg and a former top Disney executive, Jeffrey Katzenberg, to form DreamWorks SKG. The deal proposed that George should agree a 2-album deal with DreamWorks, who would distribute the record in North America, Virgin Records taking care of the rest of the world. DreamWorks and Virgin would pay $40 million between them to Sony, and George would receive a $10 million advance against royalties. His royalty rate would be a massive 20%. Sony would retain a 2 to 4% royalty for both albums, and we could release a greatest hits album including tracks from the new records. George's £4 million legal costs would be jointly taken care of by DreamWorks and Virgin. During his enforced break, he sung uncredited on a single by an unknown British singer, Lisa Morris's version of Wham's I'm Your Man. It couldn't be released until the Sony battle had been settled. It was only a minor hit, but introduced George to producer John Douglas, who then worked with him on the tracks for the next album, Older. The music had more of a soul feel than George's earlier solo efforts, and he changed his look once more, bringing in the Roman crop and a goatee beard. When the Jesus to a Child single and video were released, it went to number 1 in Britain and number 7 in America. The follow-up single, Fast Love, did the same in Britain and reached number 8 in the States before the Older album finally hit the shops. It was Virgin's fastest-selling album ever in Britain, going straight in at number 1 and selling more than the rest of the artists in the top 20 chart put together. It broke records all over the world except America, where it could only manage 6th spot. A third single, Spinning the Wheel, stuck at number 2 in Britain. George was still set against touring, but decided to do a couple of solo concerts, one for MTV's Unplugged series and the other for the BBC Radio. There was an interview with Chris Evans, which coyly talked around his homosexuality, and another in The Big Issue, in which he mentioned a new partner, but didn't say it was Texan Kenny Goss. The death of his mother from cancer rudely punctured the happy mood, but George's compassion for others surfaced quickly with the next Capital Radio Help a London Child Easter appeal. He had collaborated with label mate Toby Burke on the latter's song Waltz Away Dreaming and donated the track, pledging to treble every pound promised by the listeners. He finally handed over $166,000. He released an EP, Star People 97, dance remixes and live tracks from the Unplugged sessions, the title track being a remix of one of the older tracks. George also started to involve himself in another issue at this time, that of music education. He was a surprise guest at the annual VH1 Honours Concert, which was dedicated to the subject, and on his return to Britain met opposition leader Tony Blair, who was just a week away from a landslide general election victory. George agreed to involve himself in the Labour Party's pledge to give access to a computer to every child in the UK.
The average straight man, if a good-looking bird came into a toilet and you're standing there and she started playing with herself, basically, I don't know any men, actually. I have plenty of straight friends. I don't know any straight men who would think, this is a public place. is against the law and I shall therefore not proceed. They would go for it. And if you heard this about one of your friends and said that then, basically, that the woman turned out to be a copper, you'd think, Christ, how could they do that to a guy, you know? And what is the difference? Where is the real difference?
He was still grieving both for his mother and for Anselmo Filippo when the tragic death of Diana, Princess of Wales, hit the headlines, and he attended the funeral at Westminster Abbey with Elton John. He dedicated his single, You Have Been Loved, to her, and the boost in sales meant that 6 tracks from the older album reached the top 3 in the single charts. In fact, it was only kept from the top spot by Elton John's own reworking of Candle in the Wind, originally inspired by Marilyn Monroe, rewritten by Bernie Taupin to reflect public feeling over the death of Diana. He reworked his Wham chart toppers for a Sony compilation album, but then history seemed to be repeating itself when it became known he was unhappy with the way DreamWorks had promoted the older album in the States, where sales were vastly inferior to Britain. It was agreed to re-release Older in America as a double CD, with remixed versions of some singles, and he gave an interview to Tony Parsons, which seemed to indicate that he felt an era in his life was ending. He joined Paul McCartney, Eric Clapton and Elton John in refusing to be drawn into Earl Spencer's controversial plans for a concert at Althorpe House in memory of his sister, Princess Diana. The Wham compilation was riding high in the charts, and he was working on tracks for a new album when on Tuesday, April the 7th, 1998, he decided to take time out in the Will Rogers Memorial Park. The public toilet restrooms, as they are called in the USA, were a well-known meeting place for homosexuals, and it appeared that when he exposed himself masturbating to another man in there, he chose an undercover police officer. For years, he had worked hard at keeping his sexuality a private matter. It was common knowledge in the music business, though, and it had drawn some barbed comments from others, like Boy George, who had come out. But it wasn't generally known to the public, except by those who had made an intelligent guess. Being forced to come out in such a negative way was more distressing to him than being caught in the act itself, which he felt was unimportant. He had always fought to have his music taken seriously, yet now he had become something of a laughing stock, especially back in Britain, where a streak of Puritan disapproval is seldom far from the surface of public life. The court fined him $810 with 2 years informal probation, which included 5 one-hour sessions of sexual counselling. He was also banned from the park and had to perform 80 hours community service in the Los Angeles area before November 1998. Perhaps in the long run, the whole affair has helped him by taking an announcement about his homosexuality out of his hands. It is all out in the open now. He always wanted to be judged on his work, and that is exactly what his many millions of fans now have a chance to do. Indeed, if the massive sales of Ladies and Gentlemen, the Very Best of George Michael is anything to go by, he has nothing to fear from public disapproval. New recordings have teamed him up with Mary J. Blige on a cover version of Stevie Wonder's song As, and have seen him record Outside, a humorous take on his arrest at the hands of Marcelo Rodriguez, the policeman involved in the Will Rogers Memorial Park. The accompanying video, of course, pushed the point a little further. It is certain there is much more to come from this gifted young man. If he is flawed, then who is not? And how many of us can produce such beautiful music?
Thanks for buying Maximum, George. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further titles on Chrome Dreams coming up soon. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.